In many ways, what you've done is you've enabled a different kind of story to be told about what sort of voices were active within the political system of Bahrain at an earlier point in history.
Previously in the literature was usually mainly seen through British colonial sources. So obviously British colonial sources are important to look at. They provide a lot of the information on it. Two things come from that. One is you need to do a critical reading of it. But at the same time, also, there is a lot of Arabic sources that were not taken into account previously.
Good evening. I am particularly pleased to have with us today Professor Omar AlShehabi, somebody whose work I've known during his time as director of the Gulf Center for Development Policies in Kuwait, and where he was also an associate professor at the Gulf University for Science and Technology. Omar AlShehabi is one of the new generation of scholars from the Gulf who have done super interesting work across a variety of domains. I've gotten to know some of his work in book form, but also in journals of a variety of sorts. And so what I'd love to do is maybe share a little bit of that, with Omar, kind of in a dialogical exchange. And so welcome, Omar.
Thank you, May, and thank you for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure to talk with you, and and to share the platform with you as well, who is also one of the amazing scholars who are from the Gulf.
Thank you. I'd love to take that as a compliment. I'm going to have to wait on the evidence for a while. But I think those kinds of conversations are really fantastic because also they enable us to go beyond not just what is the work that got produced, but in a way also how was it produced? What was the thinking sort of behind the process? So maybe what we'll do today is talk a little bit about some of the work that I've personally read and also really admired. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about your own kind of intellectual and academic trajectory and how that's mapped out to a variety of spaces that you've occupied over the course of your career. And then finally, we can end with a question on the role of emotion in your work. And so if we start off with maybe the most recent thing that I've read for you, which is your book, Contested Modernity, which gives a really interesting overview of the intellectual history and political engagement in Bahrain, which, according to you, happens across sectarian lines. And so in many ways, what you've done is you've enabled a different kind of story to be told about what sort of voices were active within the political system of Bahrain at an earlier point in history. And much of this work relies on sources that were in Arabic, so a different set of sources than what are often used to study Bahrain. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that.
First of all, thanks again. This book specifically, to give a quick overview of what I try to focus on in this book, it basically examines the period in Bahrain from the late 19th century up until the 1920s and up until the 1930s. And this is an interesting period because you had at the same time several things happening. So one is you had intensifying British colonialism. You also had basically a rise of new intellectual currents in Bahrain that were tied to what's usually called Al-Nahdha Renaissance in the wider Arabic in the wider Arab world and also in the Indian Ocean. So, new ideas about reform, political freedom, anti-colonialism, literary, new forms of literary that were all combined together, Islamic reform, etc. So, and also at the same time, you also by the 1920s had the rise of political mobilization based also on on ethnicities that started also intensifying during these periods. So all of these different elements. And finally, also, you then had the rise of, as a system of rule, let's call it modernized absolutism. That was also, at least what I try to argue, is born in Bahrain for the first time in the Gulf. So all of these things kind of were going on at the same time during this period. And I found it a very interesting period to look at because of all of these things happening together, which is why, I guess the name comes as contested modernity. And because also at the same time, this period previously in the literature was usually mainly seen through British colonial sources. And so obviously British colonial sources are important to look at. They're very, they provide a lot of the information on it, but that also, you need to, two things come from that. One is you need to do a critical reading of it, but at the same time also there is a lot of Arabic sources that were not taken into account previously. So so all of this basically, and plus usually a lot of the previous literature would use the colonial archives mainly or exclusively, and also would read it mainly through sect lines. So, I thought it would be interesting to re-examine this period through a more critical look, and using both colonial and also Arabic sources, because a lot of these issues were also germinating for the first time in the Gulf, and Bahrain was the epicenter of it. Intensifying colonialism, modernized absolutism being born for the first time, at least that's what I argue. Rise of political mobilization based on sect or ethnicity. So all of these together, I thought, this would be, I think, a very crucial period to look at.
That's so interesting, honestly, because I think in many ways, the ways in which kind of sectarianism operates in a lot of the academic literature is almost as if it's this like timeless thing, right? This thing, it's historic, and there's almost no use in even revisiting the idea that it may be reproduced in particular periods of times through a variety of other kinds of factors, including the ones you had mentioned, the political, certainly colonialism and others that would either amplify or maybe in other kinds of situations downplay some of those differences. And so what's super fascinating about your work is in some ways you are almost arguing that there were periods when actually, the kind of sectarian thing almost didn't matter, but in other periods it was politicized in ways that really made it highly problematic. And this politicization is also tied to a particular kind of not only colonial archiving of what was happening at the time, but also the academic reading of the colonial archive, which somehow also reproduces that kind of fixed sectarian category. And so that sort of critical approach has really been almost like a thread through a lot of your academic writing. So another piece that I read for you that was fascinating for me was the article that you have in the British Journal of Middle East Studies on where essentially you trace the colonial origins of the Kafala system in the Gulf. And so in this work, rather than just kind of focusing on a lot of the Arab sources, or what could be called the Arab archive, you actually focus specifically on the British colonial archive, but essentially you read it against the grain. So rather than just taking for granted that this archive is a documentation of things that happened during this period, you read it with an eye of saying, well, this was written by a group of people who also had economic and political interests in the Gulf. And so let's see, how did they talk about foreigners? How did this difference between locals and foreigners appear? And how did it perpetuate even after the British themselves left? And so I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about this kind of emergence of a category from the British colonial archive that interestingly had staying power until today, but we lost the memory of the origin of where it came from.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're in many ways explaining it better than me, and I'm so grateful and thankful that you're engaging with the work in such a manner. Yeah, I mean, basically the way this article started is exactly as you said. I was working on a book in Arabic on the political economy of the Gulf. And obviously, if you want to look at the political economy of the Gulf, you need to look at the in many ways unique or interesting phenomena in the Gulf, that the majority of the workers and, let's say, the labor market, as it's called in the Gulf, is made up of migrants. And so I wanted to go back and understand the kind of history of how this emerged. And within that also understand what's usually called the Kafala system, which, or the sponsorship system that usually regulates migrant labor migration to the Gulf, basically. And I looked at the literature on what was available on it. And basically the kind of leading, what were usually assumed the way of understanding it was that this is an old Bedouin custom. And, it didn't really, I was like, this doesn't really fit with, this is a very, modern bureaucratic system and, has, legal and bureaucratic procedures attached to it. So, to say it's an old Bedouin custom. Anyway, so I thought, okay, you know what, maybe a good place to start is let's start where the first kind of quote unquote modern bureaucracy was implemented in the Gulf, which again, this also ties to maybe what we were talking in contested modernity, because all of these things started emerging together. That basically the first kind of modernized, what we would consider along, modern rational lines bureaucracy was put in place in Bahrain. By the British again during this period. So I was like, okay, let's explore these different aspects of it. And so, I had to go back basically to the period of the early 20th century to look at how these different, as you said, categories and the legal bureaucratic complexes around them were being formed, because, this was the period when regionally borders started forming. When you started having passports being formed. And then also in Bahrain, once the British had more control over local affairs, they basically they took jurisdiction over what quote unquote foreigners. Now back then, this is before oil, before borders, people, used to move and work across the Gulf countries. There were no borders. And this has been going on for centuries, a lot of movement across the Gulf countries. And especially also when there was for the pearl industry. And so
there were also connections with Persia and South Asia and Africa that also came in, circulated, and sort of, were not regulated in a very particular kind of way.
Yes, exactly. So, most of the circulation was around the Gulf, but this also extended into the wider, Indian Ocean, as they call it, Western Indian Ocean circulation, especially with goods. And also there was obviously with people. And then, specifically in the Gulf, there would also be lots of movement, especially in the pearling season. And this is actually what in the beginning started for the British for them, in Bahrain, because Bahrain was kind of one of the epicenters for the pearling industry, is that this kind of movement in the during the pearling season became two things. One, as they said, is it's an economic necessity, and two, but at the same time, they started looking at it as a security threat or something that needs to be regulated. Basically, it needs to be economic, but there's also a security part to it. So basically, all of these new kind of categories and policies started being put in place. First in the pearling industry. So this is where we have the first kind of concepts that that we usually associate with the kafala, that basically any worker that would become coming in, quote unquote, from outside, or as would be called a foreigner under their categorization from other places in the Gulf, would need to have a local sponsor, a ship captain. The ship captain would need to put a deposit etc. And then this was combined after time with the no objection certificates, especially when this started being, once the oil industry came into being, which also was the first place to start in Bahrain. So Bahrain was also the first place where, in the western shores of the Gulf, where oil was discovered. And so, basically this system was then also applied to the oil industry when now more and more migration started coming from areas beyond the Gulf, where, it was usually the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, with also other places. Now, suddenly you'd have more migration coming in, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. And then suddenly you'd have all of these new bureaucratic procedures that were put in place, including, this is also something that I discussed in the paper, things such as bachelors, what usually are today called like bachelors, male migrant workers who in many cases are not really bachelors. They have families back home, but they obviously come as bachelors.
But it becomes a category that is essentially a bureaucratic category used to regulate the movement, but also the management of this population in Bahrain and presumably later the broader Gulf, right?
Exactly. So you have these categories that once they are created and have laws and procedures and movements surrounding them, they've taken a real effects on the ground. So suddenly now you have someone who's a male bachelor migrant that has to be tied to a sponsor, and that basically his presence in the country is dependent on him having a sponsor that would sponsor him. And so, you have all of these different, and that he would need to get a no objection certificate, he would need to put a deposit, etc. So these things start having effects on the ground, even in terms of things like accommodation. So then you'd have, quote unquote, bachelor accommodation is different than someone who's considered, more middle class, or someone who could bring their family with them. And so you see how these categories start being formed and then have real effects on the ground. And the interesting thing is you can follow this through time, starting from the early 20th century up until then, how it starts to change with independence. So basically during this time, the British had jurisdiction over all foreigners. So foreigner also becomes a category where certain bureaucratic legal complexes are formed. And then basically once independence happens in these countries, where, as they call it, jurisdiction is retroceded back to these countries. Now, the newly independent countries have jurisdiction over foreigners. But now you see some changes as well that are today, that are up until today. For example, once the countries became independent and retrocession happened, you would have that, for example, a foreign migrant worker needs to be sponsored by someone who is a citizen, or a company that's owned by citizens. So previously, under the British, it was a similar system, but it could still be that a foreign owner of a company can sponsor workers. This starts getting changed, so that only restricted, so that only citizens or companies owned by citizens can sponsor workers, which now creates a different dynamic as well, in terms of that builds on the one before, but adds new dimensions to it. So I think, it's interesting to follow, as you said, how these different categories and the complexes around them and the relationships change over time. And I think what you said about reading the archives against the grain is important, or is interesting in this, because it's if you just look at it from the perspective of the administrator, is basically, you would only, some things you would not be able, you would just see basically him saying, okay, I need to regulate workers coming in and out. But if you start tying it to what the situation we are in today, and also looking at the steps of how it develops over time, you start to be able to connect all of these different dots together. And in a way, these two, if we want to connect it to the one before, we talked about contested modernity. These two, kind of the book and this paper, the projects were connected because I was actually working on them in tandem. Or at least the Arabic book and contested modernity, and that you find all of these different elements that combine. So, when I was saying that in this period is the rise of modernized absolutism in Bahrain, and also intensification of colonialism, and new political movements, etc. This was also the time when you saw the bureaucracy forming that would also regulate Kafala, and also the migration for work to the Gulf. So it's this is how I think things start to get in, and you move from one to the other, I guess, and from one topic, and see the connections between them. Although at the beginning it might not seem like there are so many connections.
So actually, this point that you're making about the connections is exactly where I want to go with this third paper that you wrote, which is that when you kind of move beyond just looking at the sort of like economic and political history of Bahrain, and you move to a kind of more urban development lens to try to understand how are the actual material spaces manifesting under a particular set of economic and political conditions that privilege ideas of development of a particular kind. What do we understand about essentially people's lives in the city if we can also take a look at how the city is being built and for whom? So you have a piece called Migration, Commodification, and the Right to the City, where essentially you sort of argue that now the city is being built for expatriates. It is actually being built for a sort of transient, and one would argue almost apolitical existence in the city. And that by doing that, we're actually reinforcing, on the one hand, some of these problematic categories that have to do with foreigners being always, not a part of the city, they're just transient, I mean, in the case of the migrant workers that you were talking about, or the bachelor worker as a term, these are people that come and work and go. But even at the level of expatriates who, let's say, are in a different kind of class position, and they're here, kind of as the middle class, in some cases as the elite, they're also being accommodated in the city in ways that presume a sort of like transient state. And I would love to know a little bit more about what this means from your perspective for the lives of citizens in the city. Because often in a lot of the migration work that I've read, there's this kind of presumption that as citizens, you're privileged, you have the right to stay, nobody kicks you out, your ability to stay in the country is not tied to your work. But in this piece, which was part of Adam Hanieh's book on transit states, you almost seem to be making the opposite argument, that while on the one hand, it is true that citizens have the right to stay, but they have the right to stay in a place that is increasingly not accommodating them and their ways of life and their desires. And so I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about this paper. What got you interested in sort of like urban studies, looking at the kind of mega developments that are happening in the city of Bahrain? And also, do you think one could easily sort of like extend this to other parts of the Gulf, or is this a very Bahrain specific phenomenon?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because this piece and a few of other pieces. So, I mean, my background is in like quantitative modeling economics. At least that was I was trained in. And when I was going to university, basically I started, university going to the UK from the early 2000s to, up until about 2009. And this was, what's called the oil boom in the Gulf. This was the time when, oil prices went up. And there were a lot of changes going on in the physical landscape in Bahrain driven by this boom. So every time I'd basically go away for 6 months or a year and come back, I'd literally see the actual landscape change. So, I'm sure, also a similar thing from what I've witnessed is also in Dubai and in other places. This real estate boom basically happened all across the Gulf.
Basically, you leave on holiday, you come back, and there's like a new, super highway in front of your house or something.
Exactly. And I mean, in Bahrain specifically, because I guess, of its size and the new projects, now these new projects that were being built were of a different type of what was happening in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s, which took on much more kind of like the shape of, oh, let's build it for social housing or for, ministries or for development projects like airports, etc. A lot of these new projects, and a similar thing happened in Dubai and a similar thing happened in Oman and in Qatar, were basically for what were called mega real estate cities, these massive newly created cities from scratch. I'm sure JBR or, Atlantis or the Palm or, all of these different ones in Dubai, similar ones you have in Bahrain and in Qatar and in Oman. That the idea behind this was now not that, they were done for social housing or for airports. It was, we're going to build kind of new international cities that are being catered towards the international market. That basically we want to have international investors that come and buy these real estate, and then new laws started being brought in with that basically whoever buys property can get a residency for a certain amount of years as long as they own this period. So for me, it was kind of following it from the start of where it was kind of like a sea, and seeing then it turn into reclaimed land, and then being something built, and then being turned into an actual city where people live, and trying to follow the social interaction that happened with that. I mean, it's a complex process, because, and I mean, it's interesting just to look at the contradictions that come out with it, because most citizens, they might own some apartments there, but they do not live there. And in some places, they're not, this is not geared for them. It's geared for high-end international investors, which again is a different type of, I guess, migrant than the kind of, if you would go, I'm not even sure migrant is the right word, compared to usually who would come to, migrants who would come to the Gulf to work in the Gulf. These were, usually affluent, middle class or above migrants that would also existed in the beforehand in the Gulf. But this was kind of now a new phenomenon where you're building cities that are supposedly geared towards them as people living in them. So, then you would like to, the interesting part is, okay, what are these dynamics that happen, especially that these new cities are supposed to be luxury and on the beach, and they're usually now become the new centers of town, where basically a lot of the activities happen around them. So yeah, it was trying to understand the dynamics and how different groups would look at them and the interaction between them that would basically be produced from that. And again, it ties to basically that to phenomenon that I get intrigued by, or that I see in front of me, literally changing, and you try to follow it and kind of follow how this process takes shape, whichever way this takes you to, whether from it's the political economy of reclaiming the land up until the kind of more urban interactions that are involved once these cities are built and how people interact with them.
Absolutely, and then takes you back even further to the point that you had raised under tracing the colonial origins of the Kafala system, of showing the relationship between these kind of urban developments and then these regulations on people's ability to stay, how what they can move, for example, in terms of finances into the country. What happens in terms of visa regulations, for example, that are meant as incentives to either attract more people to be able to come and to be able to stay for longer periods of time or not. So these things are highly interconnected. And I think what's really fascinating about your work, whether we're talking about contested modernity or tracing the colonial origins of the Kafala system, or even this last piece on sort of migration urban development and the city, is that in many ways, one would say that you take what is a sort of like refreshing decolonial approach to really trying to understand the economic and political development of Bahrain and the broader Gulf. And so you are really centering the kind of, what are actually global, so not Gulf-specific phenomenon. And we've known from the work of decolonial scholars in a variety of regions in the world, whether it's Latin America or in South Asia or in other places, that some of these kinds of dynamics also operate in other places. Yet what's also really interesting is you show their connections to, this particular contemporary moment. And what's fascinating is that the process of knowledge production that you yourself have followed, I would argue, is also decolonial. So not only are you producing work in which the content takes a decolonial approach, but the way in which you are producing this work is also a decolonial process. And let me tell you what I think I mean by that, which is that you are somebody that is actually trained in economics. So you pointed out earlier that you did, in your initial academic project, things like economic modeling. You've had relationships with places like the IMF, for example. You and I both studied at Oxford, right? And we talked about how it's weird that we didn't even know each other when we were there, because we actually overlapped for quite a bit. But in many ways, one would argue that it's highly surprising that somebody like you could ultimately produce any work that is in some ways decolonial, right? But perhaps that is exactly the point, that you have to know the heart of the thing in order to be able to call it out. And so what I want to ask you here is, how is it that somebody who is trained in economics gets to dabble a little bit in economic history, gets to ask questions about urban studies, gets to fundamentally rethink questions of translation and knowledge production in a region? I'm just very curious about the ways in which your own intellectual trajectory, your process, has led you to this point.
First of all, again, thank you. That's a very, I don't think I would have ever been able to put it that well. But I think it's basically, all I can talk about is my personal experience. And I started off, doing economics. I started, in fact, if we want to start from the beginning, I've always kind of had a rebel thing going on with whatever I study. So I started at Oxford, an undergraduate, doing a course called Economics and Management. And within a term, I just was like, I can't do this anymore. Management and economics, and it was just like, this is not what I wanted to do. So, and I don't know if anyone knows the English system. It's very hard to switch once you start. It's not like the American where you could be like, oh, I'm going to change my courses later. So I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to switch to politics, philosophy, and economics. And they told me, actually, you can't do that. You'd have to wait a year and reapply. I was like, guys, I've done half of it, the economics. Let me at least try. So they're like, okay, fine. You're over the Christmas break, you can do the exams when the students come back. If you can somehow do the philosophy part, which I've never done before, then we'll let you go with them. So I just studied on my own, basically philosophy. I remember I stuck for like a Christmas, for basically the Christmas holiday, for a month in going to the dingy library. There.
The Bodleian?
Basically, the new Bodleian, not even the nice Bodleian, the new Bodleian. Anyway, and I was the only pretty much person there, and I had to teach myself philosophy. I've never done philosophy, and very analytic English philosophy about someone who's had a science background and suddenly is like needs to deal with words like epistemology and ontology and so I think that just from the beginning, I got two things from that. Is one, to kind of be a bit like, to be able to explore things on my own and not to be tied to a certain course and discipline, and that I have to stick to that and to, follow that in one way, that I can basically first teach, be okay with learning by myself.
Mm.
and going with that. And two is, not to be constrained by rigid boundaries and go whichever way you want to explore. And then in the master's and the PhD, I stuck to with the economic modeling because I really didn't know what I was doing. But always, I had always an intrigue of doing the other readings, and that is basically. I kept doing that when I was doing the PhD. I was doing the economic modeling, but most of my time I was spending it reading and hanging out with people who are doing history and more interdisciplinary approaches. And this just stuck with me. And I think what was, for me, the important thing is that I just took that and I said, okay, let's just use that as a way to explore whatever issues I find that was interesting. So, or that like I found where, trying to explain the social world that were going on around me. So, as I said, when every time I'd go back to Bahrain, the place would change. I used to live in the historic city. Still, when I'm in Bahrain, in the historic city of Muharraq. And every time I'd go back, it would change. The social makeup of the neighborhood would change that I was in. The surrounding areas would change. The sea would get away further and further. New buildings would come up. And this was kind of what drove me to be like, you know what? I think it's just go with, whatever phenomenon you want to try to explore more, and just go with whatever toolbox or methodology or discipline that you need to explore that. Don't because of maybe the experience I had, I never felt myself comfortable being said that I'm like an economist or whatever, and I just thought let's just explore the phenomenon and just use whatever you think is as useful towards that. Now this is not a very helpful way usually for people who are in I guess in very rigid departments, especially as for things like promotion, etc. But I think in terms of just exploring different phenomenon and trying to actually if we look at social sciences or humanities, it's trying to explain certain phenomenons. That would be the for me, that has been the way to follow it, is basically don't don't narrow yourself to a specific discipline.
So if I can bring this full circle, so what I think is so interesting about what you're saying is that in a way you've really approached a lot of the academic questions that you've been asking from a place of self-understanding, like a desire to understand the world around you on issues that you care about, that you feel connected to. And so rather than the question emerging from a discipline, sort of like, oh, here's the gap, that emerged because so-and-so did this, and this is the missing piece. You're actually kind of leaving the ivory tower aside for a moment and generating a set of questions that are tied to the material realities that you find yourself in, and going back to academia to kind of almost like sample the tools that you would need in order to make sense of what you're seeing. And I would argue that by definition is a sort of decolonial process. And what's super interesting too about what you're saying is that in some ways, much of this work may not have been possible within a very traditional academic setup, right? Where all the incentives, like the rewards and the punishments, are based on like a rigid set of kind of like, I suppose, like academic products that are legible in the system. So in order to say, I've made, an immense or like a value added contribution to economics, you have to stick to economics, you have to continue in economics, you have to prove a sort of cumulative thing that adds up. But by doing that, you're really working within the category, right? And so again, your questions academically about categories, how they emerged in the Gulf, how they got reproduced, how they got reinforced, seems to also be in play in the kind of practice of it for you. I mean, the sort of desire to almost push up against the category as the singular defining feature of your work or even of yourself. And so I find that really actually very inspiring and interesting. And, I think as I, continue myself to be in conversation with people who I think have really done this kind of very radical work, not just of working against taken for granted questions about the Gulf or assumptions about what we know about this region, simply because it's always been done this way, but also people who are radical in the sense that they are interested in creating very different kind of spaces within the academy by which to ask different kinds of questions. So really, I thank you so much, Umar, for providing us with a lot of food for thought. And perhaps, this last question that I have, which is kind of on the role of like emotion in your work, is already, sort of been touched upon perhaps by this last story that you told us about going back to Pembroke and seeing the changes and trying to make sense of them. But is there anything else that you'd like to share about, like, in a way, what is the sand in your oyster? Like, what is the thing that produces a pearl, over time?
I think like, and I mean, this is just one more part to add to it. And I think to the parts that I said before, I have been very lucky in some way through the Gulf Center for Development Policies, and maybe this might illuminate some of the issues. So this is basically the center was, I was kind of asked to come by people who had an academic background from the region, and who but had a critical outlook and were frustrated that in the Gulf we do not have many independent research centers that look at the social issues on the Gulf, and wanted to set it up. And so, even the setup of the center, that it's has its own endowment, it's open to explore its own issues in Arabic, it's independent, try to take a critical look on the Gulf. This was for me in many ways kind of a dream, and this is what I've spent the last 10 years. In fact, it's what switched me back to academia. I was outside of academia before this, and it just brought me back. And the idea was that, let's try to create in the Gulf a space for people who want to do critical work, whatever it is, outside of discipline, critical work within social sciences generally, and that was geared towards certain goals, to be more critical, to look at things more independently, and to try to create a network on this that is based in the region, is independent, it's in Arabic, and so this in many ways was my motivating factor, was trying to basically try to help. And so, I mean, it's a grand dream, and I don't know if we'll ever, but just to try to somehow help in the idea of critical independent knowledge production in the region, and to try to build some form of institutions that look at that, and networks of people that do that. And so, this is basically what the center tried to, I tried to do with the center. And and so this is why, in fact, most of my work is actually in Arabic. It's not in English, but I try to combine the two, because I think there is a lot, that is going on in both, that is, unfortunately, there's a lot of silos between them. Sure. And for a lot of reasons of, and this is maybe for another time, for another talk, the political economy of the whole in fact, this is maybe one thing that also motivates me, is nowadays more and more, is the political economy of knowledge production in the Gulf. And maybe this is something just for food for thought in the end, is the kind of political economy that goes in knowledge production, and let's say in English on the Gulf, and institutions that produce in English, whether in the Gulf or in institutions outside the Gulf, versus the political economy of knowledge production in Arabic, and the different dynamics between each of them, and the issues and challenges that are involved in each of them, because they're very different. And so this for me, and more is the kind of one of the main motivating factors.
Yeah, I think that's
advice.
really fantastic, and I think it resonates with my own experience, having published things in Arabic for a primarily Arabic-speaking audience, but then also having to navigate an academy which has very clear structures and very clear ideas and hierarchies about what counts and what doesn't count. And so, how does one do that? And I think for a new generation of Gulf scholars who are really kind of at the moment in this terrain. I mean, many of my friends and some, I would argue, even mentees who are still currently doing their PhDs abroad, either in the UK or the US or in other places, and are really having to make kind of big decisions about how is it that they're going to publish and in what way and in what language for what purpose. These are things that have major implications for one's career, but also for one's political engagement, right? Like for one's sense of connection to the place where one is. So I think these kinds of stories about what the infrastructure looks like and how it is siloed, or if one attempts to remove those silos, how does one do it? Partially also because we know for a fact that knowledge production is not this neutral thing, right? Like knowledge production is produced by some kinds of people about some kinds of places in particular kinds of ways, and it has real implications. And so in addition to many of the issues of, for example, access or availability of data or archives or whatever, they're often raised by, I think, a lot of people who are in Gulf studies, or now, I've heard the term Arabian studies, in the US Academy, which I think are legitimate questions. There are also questions about power, about who gets to speak on behalf of who is data, who actually gets to have a voice. And I think in many ways, people who occupy this interesting kind of position as both producer of the work, but also a person who lives with the work, lives in the work, right? Gives you kind of a different, perhaps, relationship to this question of knowledge and how it gets produced. So really, Omar, thank you so much. And I feel like, this is perhaps the beginning of another conversation, a part two, perhaps, on knowledge production. And perhaps in that one, we do the talk in Arabic. I think that could be super interesting. So I'm not throwing something, I'm not throwing another thing on your to-do list, because I know you have a lot going on at the moment, but just food for thought, because I think those kind of conversations unfortunately don't happen. And when they do, there's often like very cookie cutter advice, which is very risk averse, right? That is given to people about how one should do things. But rarely from people who are actually in positions like ours, like being based here and navigating a whole range of things here. So really, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what your next big thing is going to be.
No, thank you very much. And I mean, as you said, I think, I mean, if that's one final thing to finish on is, for us, it's also a lived experience, this knowledge production and how to deal with it, and in the region. And it's just, just the different factors at play between what happens in, when you're producing in English, and institutions that mainly focus in English, and that in Arabic is a super important one. And it's also in terms of the audience, right? I mean, you're in English, the audience is mainly other academics who do some form of thing related to the Gulf. But in Arabic, it's an audience that is, also in the region, that is not necessarily academic. So anyway, we'll leave this to a different time.
Yeah, and you have a growing community of people who live in the Gulf who only speak English, right? So there's actually a complexity there, like in terms of like what the conversation is and with whom. So anyway, so I know it's quite late where you are, so I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but really thank you so much for this. It was so fantastic.
Thank you, and I look forward to many more conversations, hopefully, and
Inshallah.
Inshallah, and keep up the great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.